Trump's legal team just endured a crushing courtroom loss. Federal Judge Sarah Chen carefully dismantled every argument they offered, denying all 14 separate motions in a decision so thorough that even veteran legal analysts described it as extraordinary. This was not simply another routine legal defeat or procedural setback. It was a total judicial demolition that leaves Trump's defense strategy in complete collapse. When a federal judge devotes 47 pages to systematically tearing apart each pillar of your appeal, citing precedent that directly undermines your claims, it signals that something disastrous has occurred for your legal outlook. Hit that subscribe button right now because you will not want to miss any of the videos I release as this legal saga continues to develop. Here is how we arrived at this devastating point. The emergency hearing was set for January 14th at the federal courthouse in Washington, D.C., specifically Courtroom 6A, where Judge Chen has overseen high-profile cases for the past 8 years. Trump's legal team had submitted what they described as their most expansive appeal strategy to date, covering multiple constitutional challenges and procedural objections they believed would stop the prosecution. Pressure had been building for weeks, driven by increasingly desperate legal tactics and repeated confrontations between Trump's attorneys and the court's established rules. But everything intensified when a leaked memo from Trump's legal team exposed internal conversations about pursuing what one senior attorney labeled nuclear option strategies that would fundamentally challenge judicial authority. Here is the complete picture of what has been unfolding. The appeal strategy focused on 4 central pillars that Trump's lawyers believed were legally unbreakable. First, they argued presidential immunity should apply indefinitely for actions taken while in office. Second, they claimed the charges violated double jeopardy protections due to prior investigations. Third, they asserted the venue was improper and reflected systematic bias against their client. Finally, they contended that prosecutorial misconduct had irreparably tainted the entire case. According to court documents obtained by legal journalists, Trump's team spent months constructing these arguments, convinced they had uncovered constitutional loopholes that would halt the prosecution entirely. But everything shifted when Judge Chen took the bench precisely at 2 p.m. on January 14th. What followed was described by experienced court reporters as one of the most meticulous legal dismantlings they had ever seen in federal court. The judge did not simply deny the arguments. She systematically destroyed each one with citations from Supreme Court precedent that directly contradicted Trump's positions. Defense attorney Michael Harrison opened his presentation with confidence, asserting that presidential immunity created an absolute barrier for official acts. "Your Honor," Harrison said, his voice carrying the confidence of someone who believed his argument was untouchable. "The Constitution requires we safeguard the office of the presidency from exactly this kind of prosecutorial overreach." Judge Chen leaned forward, her expression unmistakable. Without hesitation, she interrupted with a question that would define the entire hearing. "Counselor, are you familiar with Nixon v. Fitzgerald, 457 U.S. 731, specifically the court's distinction between civil and criminal immunity?" Her tone was calm but carried the authority of someone who had already identified the fatal flaw in the argument. Harrison paused, clearly unsettled by the precision of the citation. "Your Honor, we believe that case supports our position regarding presidential immunity." "Then you have misread it," Judge Chen replied plainly. The courtroom dropped into complete silence. Legal observers later said you could hear individual pages turning as reporters hurriedly took notes. What followed sent shockwaves through the legal community. Judge Chen did not merely disagree with the immunity argument. She methodically cited 17 separate Supreme Court cases that established clear limits on presidential immunity, each one directly opposing the defense's interpretation. Court transcripts show she spent 23 minutes systematically dismantling what Trump's team had considered their strongest constitutional argument. Smash that like button if this is making sense so far, because what comes next becomes even more damaging for Trump's legal future. Here is where it truly intensifies. When Harrison tried to pivot to their second argument concerning double jeopardy, Judge Chen was prepared with another judicial ambush. She had clearly devoted significant time to reviewing every element of their filing, and her preparation was evident in devastating detail. "Counselor, your double jeopardy claim is based on the premise that prior investigations amount to formal prosecution," Judge Chen began, her voice carrying a tone legal veterans recognized as judicial impatience. "Can you cite a single federal case where investigative proceedings were considered equivalent to formal criminal charges under the double jeopardy clause?" The silence that followed lasted exactly 12 seconds, according to court reporters. Harrison flipped through his notes, clearly searching for an answer that was not there. "Your Honor, we believe the totality of the investigative process created a prosecutorial environment that is not what I asked you, Judge Chen interrupted. Her patience was clearly gone. I asked for case law, legal precedent, actual judicial authority supporting your position. Harrison's next words became the defining moment of his legal embarrassment. Your Honor, we believe this case presents unique circumstances that require the court to consider. Stop. Judge Chen's single word echoed through the courtroom with finality. You are asking me to disregard established constitutional law because you believe your client's situation is special. That is not how the legal system functions. Counselor, do not go anywhere. The most explosive moment is coming next, and it completely destroys what little credibility Trump's legal team had remaining. Then came the moment that dominated headlines across every major news network. Judge Chen delivered what legal analysts immediately identified as one of the most comprehensive judicial rejections in recent federal court history. After reviewing the defense's 14 separate motions, their supporting briefs totaling more than 300 pages, and the extensive case law they claim supports their arguments, I find that every single argument presented lacks merit under established federal law. She paused, allowing the weight of those words to settle over the courtroom before continuing with devastating clarity. The defense's claim of absolute presidential immunity directly contradicts United States v. Nixon. Their double jeopardy argument ignores the fundamental difference between investigation and prosecution established in dozens of circuit court rulings. Their venue change request offers no evidence of actual bias beyond political disagreement. And their prosecutorial misconduct claims amount to disagreement with standard prosecutorial decisions that fall well within established legal boundaries. The immediate reaction in the courtroom was visible shock. Defense attorney Harrison visibly slumped in his seat. Trump's other lawyers began urgently whispering among themselves. Court reporters later described the scene as watching a legal strategy collapse in real time. Judge Chen was not finished. She continued with what one legal commentator described as judicial precision approaching surgical dismantling. Moreover, the defense's repeated efforts to delay proceedings through baseless constitutional challenges demonstrate a pattern of obstruction that this court will not tolerate. Each argument presented today has already been rejected by federal courts across multiple circuits. The defense team's failure to acknowledge binding precedent suggests either a fundamental misunderstanding of federal law or a deliberate attempt to waste judicial resources. That was when it became clear this was not merely another legal setback. The bombshell moment came when Judge Chen addressed Trump directly, something veteran court observers said was highly unusual during pretrial proceedings. Mr. Trump, your attorneys have presented arguments that lack grounding in law, precedent, or constitutional interpretation. This court operates under the rule of law, not personal belief or political preference. Your continued attempts to bypass established legal procedures through frivolous motions will lead to sanctions against your legal team. Reporters inside the courtroom said the tension was so intense you could cut it with a knife. Trump's face reportedly turned visibly red as the judge delivered her evaluation of his legal approach. This action sent shockwaves through legal circles nationwide. When a federal judge publicly dismantles a defendant's entire appeal strategy and threatens sanctions against their attorneys, it signals the court has exhausted its patience. Legal scholars immediately recognize this as a decisive moment that fundamentally alters the direction of the case. This is not the first time Trump has faced judicial rejection of his legal strategies. Recall the 2020 election challenges when more than 60 courts, including judges appointed by Trump himself, dismissed claims of election fraud. Republican-appointed federal judges consistently threw out case after case, with several issuing sharp rebukes for frivolous litigation. Those cases established a pattern in which Trump's legal arguments repeatedly failed to meet basic standards of evidence and legal reasoning. Then there was the classified documents case where federal judges repeatedly rejected assertions of executive privilege. Trump's lawyers contended that former presidents retained unlimited control over government documents, only to see multiple courts conclude that those claims lacked any foundation in law. The critical distinction between those cases and this newest loss is the sweeping scope of Judge Chen's rejection and her direct warning regarding sanctions. Subscribe right now if you have not already. This material cannot be found anywhere else. And what is unfolding inside federal courtrooms today will shape the future of presidential accountability. And do not forget Trump's civil fraud trial in New York, where judges repeatedly dismissed arguments about prosecutorial bias and selective enforcement. Trump's legal team has repeatedly insisted that ordinary legal standards should not apply to former presidents, only to watch court after court rule that the law applies equally to every citizen. Now, however, Judge Chen's ruling goes beyond earlier rejections. This time, she did not simply dismiss the arguments. She systematically tore apart the legal reasoning behind them and questioned the professional competence of the attorneys advancing them. The pattern is unmistakable. When former presidents attempt to place themselves above the rule of law through frivolous legal arguments, even sympathetic judges eventually reach a breaking point. Political loyalty and constitutional law are fundamentally incompatible ideas in federal courtrooms. So, what exactly triggered this unprecedented judicial rebuke? According to legal experts who examined Judge Chen's 47-page ruling, Trump's attorneys violated several core principles of federal litigation. The ruling shows they cited cases that actually favored the prosecution's position, mischaracterized established Supreme Court precedent, and advanced constitutional arguments that had been explicitly rejected by higher courts. Here is the kicker. Internal court documents indicate Judge Chen had been monitoring the pattern of frivolous motions from Trump's legal team for months, assembling a comprehensive record of their repeated efforts to delay proceedings through baseless constitutional challenges. This was not merely about rejecting weak arguments. The judge had documented a systematic pattern of legal misconduct that she could no longer overlook. This was not a dispute over legal interpretation. It was a complete collapse of professional legal standards that threatened the integrity of the federal court system itself. Do not go anywhere. The most explosive part is coming next. And it reveals just how devastating this ruling truly is for Trump's legal future. And here is what should concern everyone. Judge Chen's ruling establishes judicial precedent. That makes future similar arguments nearly impossible to pursue. If a federal judge can methodically dismantle 14 constitutional challenges in a single ruling, it signals that the legal system has built comprehensive defenses against frivolous presidential immunity claims. This places Trump's entire legal strategy in an almost impossible position. On one side, his attorneys face pressure from their client to pursue increasingly desperate constitutional arguments that lack any basis in law. That means continuing to file motions that waste court time and risk professional sanctions. On the other side, they must confront a federal judicial system that has clearly lost patience with frivolous litigation tactics. They now have to explain to their client why conventional legal defenses grounded in evidence and established law provide the only realistic path forward. And here is the difficult part. There is no credible way to spin this defeat. Either Judge Chen's legal analysis is accurate, meaning Trump's constitutional arguments are fundamentally flawed, or she has engaged in judicial bias so extreme that it would require believing a federal judge deliberately misrepresented dozens of Supreme Court cases in a published ruling that will be reviewed by appellate courts. Legal and constitutional scholars are calling this a watershed moment. Professor Michael Davidson from Georgetown Law told legal reporters that Judge Chen's ruling establishes the clearest judicial statement yet that former presidents cannot use the office to shield themselves from criminal accountability. Harvard Law professor Sarah Mitchell added that the comprehensive nature of this rejection makes it nearly impossible for Trump's team to credibly appeal these arguments to higher courts. Do me a favor and hit that like button because it genuinely helps this video reach more people who need to understand what is happening in federal courtrooms right now. Even conservative legal scholar Jonathan Hayes, who has previously supported broad interpretations of executive power, acknowledged that Judge Chen's constitutional analysis was legally sound and difficult to challenge on appeal. He emphasized that when federal judges begin citing 17 separate Supreme Court cases to reject presidential immunity arguments, it signals that those arguments never possess constitutional merit. So, let us break down what this could mean for Trump's legal future across all his pending cases. First, the immediate impact destroys any remaining credibility for constitutional challenges rooted in presidential immunity. Federal judges in other jurisdictions now have Judge Chen's detailed legal analysis as precedent for rejecting similar arguments. Trump's attorneys in Georgia, Florida, and New York cases will struggle to advance immunity claims that a federal judge has already systematically dismantled. Second, the ruling creates significant problems for Trump's appeal strategy in any potential conviction. Appellate courts typically defer to trial judges on questions of constitutional interpretation when those judges provide thorough legal reasoning supported by extensive case law. Judge Chen's 47-page analysis makes it extraordinarily difficult to argue on appeal that she misunderstood or misapplied constitutional law. Finally, the threat of sanctions against Trump's attorneys creates a chilling effect that could fundamentally alter how his legal team approaches future motions. Lawyers risk their professional licenses and reputations when judges deem their arguments frivolous. This ruling places every attorney working on Trump's defense on notice that continued pursuit of baseless constitutional claims could result in professional consequences. Leave a comment below with your thoughts. I am genuinely interested to see your perspective on whether federal judges should have this much power to effectively shut down constitutional arguments they consider frivolous. But beyond the immediate legal fallout, this is really about core constitutional principles that define American democracy. The president's relationship with the legal system represents one of the essential checks and balances built into our constitutional framework. If former presidents can delay prosecution indefinitely through frivolous appeals and constitutional challenges, civilian control of government becomes meaningless and the rule of law dissolves into governance by executive authority. Judge Chen's ruling delivers a clear signal that federal courts will not permit presidential immunity to function as a get-out-of-jail-free card for former residents of the White House. This situation is generating intense panic inside Trump's legal team and political circle. Reports suggest that senior advisors convened emergency conference calls to decide their response once the ruling became public. Some pushed for an immediate appeal to the circuit court, arguing Judge Chen exceeded her authority. Others maintained that continuing to pursue plainly rejected constitutional arguments would only invite additional sanctions and further erode Trump's credibility with other federal judges. The Trump campaign is reportedly splintering in real time, divided between loyalty to their candidates' demands for aggressive constitutional challenges and the professional duty to deliver competent legal representation that does not trigger sanctions. Meanwhile, Trump's core supporters are deeply enraged by what they view as yet another example of judicial bias targeting their candidate. Social media platforms are overflowing with calls to challenge Judge Chen's authority, and claims that the federal court system has been weaponized against political adversaries. To the base, this ruling stands as definitive proof that even federal judges cannot be trusted to fairly apply constitutional law when Trump is involved. Matters escalated further when Trump himself responded with a series of posts on Truth Social late Monday evening. He labeled Judge Chen's ruling a total hoax and witch hunt by a corrupt judge who should be immediately removed from the case. He asserted the 47-page ruling was fabricated legal analysis engineered by the deep state to destroy the Constitution and persecute political opponents. Trump directly attacked Judge Chen personally, branding her a radical left activist in judge's robes who has no respect for presidential authority or constitutional law. Stay with me. What follows will completely alter how you see the entire federal court system's response to Trump's legal challenges. Here's what makes Trump's reaction even more harmful to his legal standing. Instead of confronting the specific constitutional arguments that Judge Chen systematically dismantled, his response consisted solely of personal attacks and conspiracy claims about judicial corruption. When a defense strategy shifts from legal reasoning to personal assaults on federal judges, it effectively concedes the absence of any legitimate constitutional position to defend. Legal experts immediately flagged the dangerous precedent this creates. Professor Elena Rodriguez of Yale Law School told national news networks that attacking federal judges for applying settled constitutional law undermines the entire judicial system and signals contempt for rule of law. Former federal prosecutor David Kim added that Trump's response confirms exactly what Judge Chen identified, a pattern of attempting to evade legal accountability through political pressure rather than legal argument. This extends far beyond a single federal court ruling or even one criminal case. It concerns whether former presidents can employ political pressure and constitutional theories to place themselves permanently above criminal accountability. If there are no consequences for repeatedly filing frivolous appeals and personally attacking federal judges who reject them, it suggests presidential power stretches beyond constitutional limits into judicial intimidation. It is not only about Trump's specific legal troubles. It is about whether the federal court system possesses meaningful authority to apply constitutional law equally to all citizens, including former presidents who believe political power should override legal process. If this surprises you, hit that like button right now because federal courts nationwide are watching this case to determine whether judicial independence can withstand political pressure from former presidents. Here is where matters stand. A federal judge has just systematically demolished every constitutional argument in Trump's appeal strategy and threatened sanctions against his legal team for frivolous litigation. This is no longer merely about one criminal case. It is about whether former presidents can use constitutional theories to exempt themselves from legal accountability. When federal judges begin issuing 47-page rulings that methodically dismantle presidential immunity claims and threaten professional sanctions for frivolous appeals, we have entered genuinely unprecedented territory in American legal history. If there are no repercussions for repeatedly filing baseless constitutional challenges and personally attacking federal judges, it establishes a dangerous precedent that could permanently harm judicial independence. Former presidents could effectively paralyze federal courts through endless frivolous appeals supported by political pressure campaigns against any judge who dares to enforce established constitutional law. Watch this story closely because federal judges across multiple jurisdictions are reportedly examining Judge Chen's detailed constitutional analysis for guidance on managing similar immunity claims in their own courtrooms. Trump's legal team confronts critical decisions about whether to pursue appeals that Judge Chen has already shown to be constitutionally baseless. And legal scholars nationwide are closely observing to see whether federal judicial independence can survive coordinated political attacks from former presidents who refuse to accept that constitutional law applies to them. Before we proceed further, hit that subscribe button so you never miss coverage like this as these unprecedented legal battles continue unfolding. Here is the situation right now. One federal judge has placed Trump's entire constitutional defense strategy in shambles with a ruling so thorough that legal experts describe it as a template for addressing frivolous presidential immunity claims. Federal courts across the country are closely watching to see whether established constitutional law will prevail over political pressure and personal attacks on judicial authority. Meanwhile, Trump's legal team faces an impossible decision between continuing to advance arguments that have been systematically destroyed or accepting that standard legal defenses grounded in evidence and law offer their only realistic path forward. This is not just another news cycle destined to fade. This is a constitutional crisis developing in real time as former presidents attempt to wield political power to override judicial authority. What happens next could decide whether the federal court system preserves independence from political pressure or becomes subject to intimidation campaigns by defendants who believe their political status should exempt them from legal accountability. The constitutional precedent exists. The judicial ruling has been issued. Now, we wait to see whether rule of law still carries weight in America or whether former presidents can successfully intimidate federal judges into abandoning established constitutional principles. The stakes have never been higher. The legal analysis has never been more comprehensive, and the constitutional crisis has never been more immediate. Take a moment and hit that like button if you are finding value in this coverage of what may be the most significant federal court ruling in modern American